This is a talk given for Morphe Arts, December 2022. I'm currently in my third year of a practice-based research PhD in music at the University of Glasgow, where my research explores prayer and contemplation, looking at them as receptive, intuitive states, both as a Christian and as a video artist and improviser. Through my work, I explore ways inspired or flow states might be conveyed through form, whilst also looking at improvisation as a means of undoing form in order to experience inspired states. I am interested in ways these states might act as an agent of transformation. Through exploring notions of surrender and receiver, I look at the shift in consciousness where the revelatory, prophetic, or unexpected can arise. A central question throughout my research asks, how might surrender, sacrifice, and gifted or flow states within artistic and ecclesial practice facilitate a site for transformative encounter? I will present this talk in 3 sections. In part 1, I will give a brief background to my practice. I'll also share some images and videos related to my current practice. Part 2 will focus on my PhD research, looking at some of the ideas and concepts that drive my practice. And finally, in part 3, I'll show a couple of recent videos from works in progress, discussing the motivations and concepts behind these works. Background. Over the years, I've been involved with music in several ways. In the 90s as a songwriter and band member, and later on as a workshop practitioner, worship leader, and more recently as an artist and improviser. In the 90s I played electric guitar in the alternative band Elastica. Our aesthetic could be described as lo-fi, post-punk DIY. Surprisingly to us, we became successful in the 90s and spent many years touring, which unfortunately led to living a hedonistic lifestyle and ultimately to addiction. After leaving the band and spending some time in a rehabilitation centre, I ended up on an Alpha course, eventually becoming a Christian in 2003. Around this time I'd formed a new band, Clang, and we had just recorded an album and were touring. But as a new Christian, I began finding it difficult to navigate being in the band and being in the music industry. Also, I began to find myself less interested in conventional rock music and more interested in the inner processes behind music, in particular in improvisation. I eventually made the decision to leave London, to leave the music industry, and to move to a Christian community, L'Abri, in Hampshire. I lived at L'Abri for a year, and in this time I became aware of theological differences between conservative evangelicals and charismatic Christians. What charismatic Christians might term a spiritual encounter, often experienced in times of worship, conservative evangelicals might view as an aesthetic experience due to the power of the music. This was the beginning of my interest in the difference and similarity between aesthetic and spiritual experience, eventually leading to the questions behind my PhD. In 2005, I left L'Abri and embarked on an art degree at Dartington College of Arts. To cut a long story short, I continued to wrestle between art and Christianity, finding it difficult to reconcile the two. The themes of my art were overtly evangelistic, and I found it hard to be subtle, to be symbolic or elusive. I decided I needed to give up the arts and to go instead into ministry. After a year of church leadership training, I moved to Birmingham to become a missionary working with people in recovery from addiction. I stayed with this ministry for 5 years. In this time, I began devising creative workshops for people in recovery, whilst simultaneously living with and helping care for 15 or so women in recovery. It was, in many ways, a pastoral role, and I found this period extremely intense. I went through a process of giving everything up, of laying down myself, my hopes and my desires. I found myself needing to connect with God to such a depth that I began praying for an hour every morning. This included the practice of praying in tongues, which helped me find a sense of connection that could sustain me and give me the ability to live out the life of service I aspired to. Throughout this time, whilst I was trying daily to die to a self-focused life, the desire to make art or to work through issues through creative practice did not go away. In fact, it continued to increase. I began to realise I needed to return to the arts, that the creative process was integral to who I was as a person. In 2016, I moved back to London and began a Masters in Music at Goldsmiths. I began to look more deeply at the parallels between inner states I experienced in prayerful contemplation and speaking in tongues, and those I experienced in improvisation. I realised in order to design or rebuild an art practice, I'd been out of the art music world by this time for about 10 years. The place I needed to start was from these inner states. I formed a free improvisation collective at Goldsmiths and also started filming videos on my phone. I realised I could experience the same contemplative state through attentive looking as I could through attentive listening. In attentive looking, by following the moment of connection, I found the surface of the image would appear to gain depth, to open. This similarly happened to me in free improvisation, where I would have a sense of consciousness opening or expanding. I began combining these videos together with the musical improvisations to create framed moments, poetic vignettes, which I began posting onto YouTube in the spirit of a sketchbook. I'll now show some stills from a few of these videos. My approach in both video making and improvisation is in many ways a mode of experimentation and play. I allow the process to unfold. My primary aim is to stay true to the work, to follow its thread. This has led to the development of a variety of methods, techniques such as intuitive collaging, animation and stop motion. I often combine self-filmed video with found film or integrate collage, drawing and animation. I'll now show some short excerpts of improvisation with videos I've made with a stop motion app. Around this time, I also began playing electric guitar in the group Down Is Up. Down Is Up is a collective that performs music primarily by the composer Moondog, a New York street musician from the 1970s. We intersperse our performances with times of improvisation and also include various pieces by other composers. In time, I began to project some of these lo-fi videos as backdrops in our performances. Here is an excerpt of us playing Coventry Cathedral earlier in the year. I'll now talk a little about the theoretical concerns behind my practice, the ideas that drive my practice. As I mentioned earlier, I'm currently in my third year of a practice-based PhD that encompasses theology and music. My working title is Improvisation as a Liminal Experience, where I explore free improvisation as an activity of attentive consciousness. Free improvisation is basically improvisation that doesn't necessarily aspire to a particular style or idiom. It has both an inner and an outer practice. The outer practice encompasses the toolkit of learned musical patterns, sounds, scales and rhythms, etc. The inner practice is a kind of intuitive attentiveness. Music therapist Evan Rood highlights this experience, saying, "Improvisation may be understood to create a situation where change, transformation, and process come into focus. In this sense, improvisation not only means to get from one place to another, but from one state to another. In this sense, improvisation means to change a relation to other human beings, phenomena, situations, maybe the very relation to oneself. In this sense, improvisation is a transitional ritual, a way of changing position, frames, status, or states of consciousness." Rood says, when shared with others, this experience has the potential to lead to a state he calls communitas, one soul connecting with another. He says this experience requires giving yourself totally, and attitudes like egoisms, possessive feelings, and the spirit of competition have to give way to generosity, closeness, and communion. This experience, this state, has an in-between quality. It is a liminal state of consciousness. The characteristics of liminality within music are outlined in the following description by June Boyce Tillman. A limen that is crossed from ordinary knowing, especially in the space-time dimension, a sense of encounter, a paradoxical knowing so that diversity can exist within it easily, a sense of empowerment, bliss, realization, a sense of the beyond, infinity, a feeling of an opening up in the experiencer as boundaries start to dissolve, a sense of transformation, change, an evanescent and fleeting quality that cannot be controlled and which may result in a sense of givenness, a feeling of unity with other beings, people, and the cosmos. Many improvisers attest to experiencing these liminal states, accessed through the activity of attentive consciousness. This experience is not unique to free improvisers. It finds parallel in other forms of artistic practice, in painting, in abstract expressionism, for instance, or in writing, in stream of consciousness. Practices which to a certain extent break down the formal communicative language of that medium. This would similarly seem to be the core of the aesthetic attitude, where the underlying dispositions are those of disinterested attentiveness or will-less contemplation. Philosopher Schopenhauer writes of aesthetic experience. When, however, an external cause or inward disposition suddenly raises us out of the endless stream of willing and snatches knowledge from the thraldom of the will, the attention is no longer directed to the motives of willing, but comprehends things free from their relation to the will. Then all at once the peace, always sought, but always escaping us, comes to us of its own accord, and all is well with us. This attentive, open, heightened state also shares parallel with experiences in flow. Flow is described as a pleasurable state of consciousness that can be accessed through total involvement in an activity. The author and psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi says flow can be achieved through many different activities, but the criterion for its achievement is total attentiveness. Athletes, climbers, artists, scientists, many experience this optimal state, where everything seems to click into place, where consciousness is heightened and time can be experienced differently. Henry Nouwen, former professor of theology at Harvard, says that the transcendent or ecstatic moment is precisely the moment when a person loses their self-preoccupation and is drawn out of their self into a new reality. He points out the word ecstasy comes from the Greek ekstasis, which is derived from ek, meaning out, and stasis, a state of standstill. This activity of losing self-preoccupation relates likewise to contemplative practice. For myself, prayerful contemplation is where I focus away from self and onto God as creator, to become present with God in an attitude of attentive and focused listening. In order to listen attentively, I have found I've needed to quiet my inner dialogue, the endless chatter of my mind. I've found various strategies for this over the years, at times repeating the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And I've also found speaking in tongues to be essential. Speaking in tongues, for me, has the effect of calming the clamouring and grasping of the mind. The resulting stillness I experience through this practice often provokes sensations of oneness, feelings of joy, expansiveness, and peace. It creates a space where I can hear God. It is a receptive state. Author and Christian speaker Patrick Dixon, a former medical student at Cambridge, offers the perspective that speaking in tongues may be a tool given by the Holy Spirit in order to turn off the left brain. He says the left side of the brain is analytical, rational, and logical, whereas the right side of the brain is intuitive and creative. Author Ian McGilchrist, in his book The Master and His Emissary, speaks of these two hemispheres of the brain and their differing perspectives. He also speaks of how we have focused in the West on the rational to our detriment. Through contemplative practice, I have found speaking in tongues to have the potential to facilitate a kind of kaleidoscopic shift in consciousness, where the narrow focus of the rational mind, the cut it makes, the slice of reality, can open to a more intuitive, wide-angle receptive state. In this regard, I have found speaking in tongues to be a mode of consciousness that can increase intuitive receptivity, creating an openness to the prophetic imagination. Author and Christian John Mark Comer, in speaking on solitude and silence, highlights the need to move beyond mind in order to experience deep communion with God. This activity of attentive communion, of intuitive receptivity, would seem a desirable state from which to develop and create art. Philosopher Martin Buber speaks of thou saying, being fully present. He says all genuine art making involves this attentive practice, this state of fully receptive presence. The painter and teacher Robert Henri writes, we make our discoveries of technique while in the state because then we are clear-sighted. He writes, the object of painting a picture is not to make a picture, however unreasonable this may sound. The object, which is back of every true work of art, is the attainment of a state of being, a state of high functioning, a more than ordinary moment of existence. Professor of music Ed Sarath similarly asserts creative substance needs to be measured not by degree of exterior novelty, but by interior integration of consciousness. Scholar and cultural critic Lewis Hyde presents this listening receptive state to be the inspired state where the artist has the sense of being a receiver, a recipient rather than a creator. According to Hyde, within this gifted state, an artist experiences the work coming through them rather than being consciously constructed by them. He says, an essential portion of any artist's labour is not creation as much as invocation. Part of the work must not be made, it must be received. He states this activity does not take place in the rational mind, but rather in intuition. He writes, we participate in the esemplastic power of a gift by way of a particular kind of unconsciousness, unanalytic, undialectical consciousness. Hyde asserts to access and to receive in this state requires attitudes of openness and surrender, to be in a state of dependency. He writes, the artist needs to create within themselves the begging bowl to which the gift is drawn. In this intuitive mode, the artist recognises what is given is not from him or herself, but is a gift. In this sense, art practice for me is very much a faith practice. It's about trusting the process, that what is invisible might become visible. Through contemplative practice, I try to stay true to what I'm shown, trusting the form will emerge over time. In this final section, I want to show work which is still very much in process. Whilst the form is not complete in many ways, the concepts behind the work feel to be quite important to me.
Re, bo, shi, ha, no, de, an, gi, a, re, ha, si, vlo, am, gi, nu, a, shi, vi, ha, ti, la, di, a.
Amana e Amana e yo Amana ha e yo Amana ha de mayona Amana ha ne yo mayona Amana ha ne yo na hona Amana ha ne yo na hona Amana ha ne yo mayona Amana ha ye yo mahiya Amana ha ye yo mahiye Amana ha ne yo mahoya Amana ha ye yo manoha Amana ha ye yo nahona Amana ha ne yo mahoa Amana ha ne yo nahona Amana ha ne yo nahona. The first excerpt is called Undoing Worlds. This title for me really sums up what the work is about. It encapsulates many of the various threads within my practice. The notion of language as world making, the way language can shape our worldview, but also when we undo language or get behind or beneath words, it somehow has the potential to open other worlds. This is something that similarly happens within improvisation, the sense of undoing music or getting in the gaps between the sounds. I also felt this piece related very much to the practice of speaking in tongues. The idea came out of an experience in contemplation where I had a vivid sense of stepping off a cliff or stepping out into space, where word sounds or shapes of sounds appeared as stepping stones under my feet. A bit like in the Indiana Jones film where he steps out into the abyss and a bridge appears as he steps forward. But in this case, I was stepping out on sounds that led out into space. I had the sense that stepping out on sounds was a practice that led out into the unknown. It had an effect of opening other realms, that it was revelatory in a prophetic sense, a practice with a prophetic capacity. I also realised after making it that this is the core of my musical improvisation practice, a practice where I follow where the sounds lead. The second excerpt, Keeping in Time, comes out of a similar experience in contemplation, one where time appeared to expand, as though my consciousness existed in a kind of timelessness, a parallel sense of time, which is also an experience I feel deeply in improvisation, as though chronos, clock time, is embedded within eternal time, within Kairos. This experiencing of time, of the eternal and the temporal intertwined, of chronos and Kairos simultaneously, is a well-documented characteristic of contemplation, improvisation and flow states. In his book Improvisation, Creativity and Consciousness, Edward Sarath writes, "In heightened or transcendent states, two kinds of time perception are possible. One is a linear, sequential flow of discrete now or present moments that is similar to that accessed in ordinary consciousness. The other is an overarching sense of an eternal present where past and future connections are subordinate. There is something about creating from a position of Kairos, of flow, that releases the artist to be a passenger in this process, in a way that is energizing. This relates to the idea of art making as play. Kurt Simonson, assistant professor at Biola University, writes, "In Kairos we are completely unself-conscious, yet paradoxically far more real than we can ever be when we're constantly checking our watches for chronological time. The saint in contemplation, lost to self in the mind, is in Kairos. The artist at work is in Kairos. The child at play, totally thrown outside herself in the game, be it building a sandcastle or making a daisy chain, is in Kairos. In Kairos we become what we are called to be as human beings, co-creators with God, touching on the wonder of creation. This calling should not be limited to artists or saints, but it is a fearful calling. To create work from flow, from Kairos, to weave this state into a piece of work, can be a kind of sharing of the Kairos state, an encounter which for the recipient might perpetuate a desire for or offer a glimpse of transcendence. It could be that these experiences point beyond themselves, that they are a foretaste, a glimpse toward the coming kingdom, a gift for us on a personal level, and as something as Christians we can offer to the world. This notion relates to art's eschatological function, art that acts as a pointer towards the coming transfiguration of the cosmos, where God will renew the whole earth. Patrick Sherry states, "The arts in their highest achievements glimpse eternal beauty and anticipate and give a foretaste of the reality beyond, which is to come. A foretaste of the coming transfiguration of the cosmos, where the temporal extension of this world will be transcended in the co-presence of all time in eternity." And I'll just end with a quote from ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who states, "Time is a game played beautifully by children."